Isaiah chapter 62. We were in Isaiah 61 last week, and it's a passage that Yeshua himself quoted when he was starting his ministry in Luke chapter 4, where he talks about he's in his hometown. He talks about the Spirit of the Lord being upon him and how it just defined much of his ministry. But today, we're moving into the next verse, the next chapter. And the timing of things is very interesting for all of this. When you consider the voices that are out there in the world, in the marketplace, in the media, and all the other places, from leaders, from the people that are making a lot of noise and a lot of hubbub in our day. They're trying to influence opinion. They're trying to influence policy. In many ways, we're hearing the voices rising that are trying to threaten and initiate conflict against God's people and against the nation, the land that God had promised. We're talking about Israel. We've already had time of prayer for that. But what we're seeing, this increased hostility and this hatred that's expressed toward the Jewish people. I was thinking about it. If it was really just about their presence in the land, well then logically you would think that it would only be that the hostility would be limited to just the Jewish people that are over there, right? That's in the land. But it's not. It's not limited to just that situation, that location, that conflict. It's really, all the Jewish people everywhere are being blamed and condemned and targeted and hated. Jews, whether they're in America, in England, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Middle East, Africa, other places, it doesn't matter. And it doesn't really matter whether those particular Jewish people support the state of Israel or not. Because there's a lot of Jewish people that aren't necessarily that interested or that supportive, but they're just as much of a target. Voices are rising against all of them, even in our own country. And that's a dangerous thing. When you read posts, when you hear things, even local posts online, the Jews are being blamed for everything. The state of Israel is the source of all the world's problems if you listen to them. If they would just disappear, then everything would be fine and everything would be better. You even hear the Zionist plotters. Y'all have been hearing about those kind of things, right? They're in control of everything, it seems, from elections in violence in Venezuela to even the boxing controversy about the man that was the Algerian boxer. He just won the gold medal in women's boxing. Right? They're being blamed for that. Some, even traditional Christians, when they debate eschatology, they talk about the significance of the modern state of Israel. I heard some of them talking about things recently because there's a wide range of opinion. Some theologies and eschatologies out there say that Israel is essential. It's the final return. And, that what we're seeing today, right now, is the final return, that they'll never be defeated again, despite the fact that it's, often very secular, that it's not a non-faith-based government and such, that Israel can do no wrong. So you've got that one end of the spectrum. And others say that the return of Israel to the land is irrelevant because, all of those promises and prophecies have been transferred to the church. There's some variation of replacement theology. You've got how they'll say that the Jews accomplished their purpose in God's plan to bring forth a Messiah, so their role is just done. They're finished. He's through with them. And they're just the same as everybody else. Far too many believers in Messiah hold to some degree or other that second opinion. On some level, it's typically there. They may not think that Israel matters all that much, if at all. Now, what happens to the Jewish people isn't really their problem. And that kind of bad theology, that kind of indifference, That's what allows all of this hatred. That's what allows all of this blame to foster. But I heard something interesting. One of those people that was debating, Israel's importance, made a very significant point. Whatever side of that spectrum uh, they may be on, whether if Israel has no prophetic significance, he pointed out, then why is the enemy working so hard to destroy it? If it means nothing, if God is done with the Jewish people, why has the enemy continued to try to kill them all? Whether they live in Israel, whether they live in New York, Paris, or London, or Knoxville, he's tried to wipe them out even before the state of Israel existed. He was still doing all of that. Why is every problem now blamed on them before all others? The demonic forces of this world still hates the Jewish people and tries to get as many people to hate them too. The powers and governments that will give rise to what's known as the Antichrist, the Anti-Messiah, still wants to destroy Israel. The enemy sure is treating Israel like they're something important, like they matter for something, as if their existence anywhere in the world is a threat, but particularly in the land of Israel is a threat. And that should be a big clue to us if we have any doubts. If the Jewish people, if Israel doesn't matter, again, why is the enemy trying so hard to destroy the nation wherever they are? Why is the enemy trying to turn opinion and leaders against them and blame them for everything? Because, again, we're right here before the 9th of Av, the Tish B'Av, a day of fasting and grieving, commemorating the destruction of the first and second temple, and many other negative events in history that happened on this same day that I know I was blind to because it was based on a different calendar. And the list is long. Just a few of them. You have, the spies that returned with a bad report of the land. They came back traditionally on the 9th of Av. Both of the temples were destroyed on the 9th of Av. The Bar Kokhba revolt against Rome was lost and the people butchered in the 130s AD on the 9th of Av. The Jews were expelled from England in 1290, from Spain in 1492, all on the same day. Germany declared war on Russia, essentially starting World War I on the 9th of Av. These are the kind of things that happen over and over and over again. Again, as if you were paying attention, you should notice a pattern. I mean, here we are. Things could happen. They could start on Monday night or Tuesday, and so this year could easily be added to that list. The threats are coming from Iran. Threats are coming from Turkey. All over the place. This year could be added to the list. So we need to be paying attention. That's one reason why we're meeting on Monday night at 6:30 to go over those kind of things. But just because that's what the world is doing and what the world is saying, what does God say? What does His Word say? How does He respond? If the enemy is still attacking, is he going to defend? Is he going to remain silent as the world turns against Israel? Isaiah 62 says no. He's not going to do that. He says, for Zion's sake I will not keep silent. For Jerusalem's sake I will not rest until her righteousness shines out brightly and her salvation as a blazing torch. It's a beautiful passage. It focuses our attention, even in the midst of all of this. In Isaiah's day, he had been telling them, he'd been warning them, he had been calling them to repentance. He'd been telling them that Babylon was coming their way soon. But there is a small word, a very important word in this passage that must be considered when we think of Israel's place in our world today. The word until. And for Zion's sake I will not keep silent, for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest until. That's a conjunction. It can talk about space, it can talk about distance, it can talk about time. This conjunction, as for as, or even to, or to the point of, until her righteousness shines out brightly and her salvation as a blazing torch. Until is important because it suggests that this action that he's talking about is going to be ongoing. It's going to continue until certain conditions, situations, and events are met. He will not be silent. He will not rest. He will not stop. On whose behalf? For Zion's sake. For Jerusalem's sake. No matter what the world is saying, that's his opinion. Many have wondered why God seems silent in this world, especially when terrible things do seem to be happening to his people, even in Isaiah's day, even all of those events on the 9th of Av. Was God silent at all those events, or is he maybe saying things that we can't hear or don't understand or don't want to hear? But this is a promise of his nature and his character, that he is going to speak, he is going to act on behalf of Zion and Jerusalem. Not just the location, but the people. The place and the people are linked together by promise and covenant made all the way back to Abraham. Abraham, or Genesis chapter 15, promises in the past that are going to continue until they are fulfilled. And if you believe it's impossible for God to lie, if you believe that God cannot break covenant or his word or his promise, then we need to believe this. That's really what Hebrews has to say. One of the passages in that book, it says, in the same way God determining to point out more clearly to the heirs of the promise the unchanging nature of his purpose, he guaranteed it. He guaranteed that future. He guaranteed that outcome, that finish, with an oath. So by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to take hold of the hope that is set before us. Right? So he made a promise, and he swore by himself, by his own character, his own nature, his own name, and he will not break it under any circumstances. Then God must be true and every man a liar. That's how Paul puts it in Romans 3. Let God be true, even if every man is a liar, as it is written, that you may be righteous in your words and prevail when you are judged. God will not be rest. He will not rest. He will not be silent until these certain conditions are met, until something happens. Despite how things may seem or appear in a particular moment in time, in the aftermath of a 9th of Av type of event, things like the Holocaust or the Babylon's invasion, none of those things mean that God has stopped, that he is silent, that he has abandoned them, because the until has not happened yet. Until her righteousness shines out brightly and her salvation as a blazing torch. Verse 7 in 62 says much the same thing. He says, on your walls, Jerusalem, I have set watchmen. All day and all night they will never hold their peace. You who remind Adonai, take no rest for yourselves. So he's calling his people to pay attention and have their purpose be the same as his. But then in verse 7 it says, those watchmen are supposed to not give him any rest until He establishes and makes Jerusalem a praise in the earth. God's people are not supposed to rest or ever stop seeking the best for Jerusalem. Never let our attention, our loyalty, our eyes drift from Jerusalem to any other city, because God's name is there. He chose to make that the place for His presence to dwell. That's where everything happens. He loves the place and the people. And if God loves a particular place and a particular people, what does the enemy think about it? He hates it. He hates everything it stands for. The enemy hates the place and the people. And if you just understand that point, that the things that God loves, the enemy hates, then what's happening today is going to make a whole lot more sense when you watch the news, when you read the newspaper or whatever else. If you accept that truth, then what's happening is no surprise. But we don't rest. Those watchmen don't rest in our reminding Him of His promises. Give Him no rest. Don't start bugging Him. Don't stop praying to Him about what's happening there. We pray for the peace of Jerusalem. It's a lot like what in Luke chapter 18, where He talks about this persistent widow. She had a situation, she had a problem, a circumstance. She kept going to this judge for justice, but he didn't really care. He was kind of like indifferent to her cause. And she kept going back, and she kept going back, and she kept going back every day, to where the guy finally was like, man, this woman's going to drive me nuts. I'm paraphrasing slightly, right? If I don't give in to her cause, she's going to keep pestering me with this all the time. And he eventually gives her the justice that she's asking for. Or it could be like the friend in Luke chapter 11 who goes to, has some guests show up. He has nothing prepared for them, so he goes to his neighbor's house and asks for help. And when the guy is saying, I'm not going to come open the door. My whole family's asleep. I'm not going to do any of that kind of stuff. But he keeps knocking until the owner of the house gets up to help. Don't let God stop hearing this prayer. Reminding Him, give Him no rest until He makes these things happen. Give Him no rest until He establishes and makes Jerusalem a praise in the earth. What do you think? Do you think Jerusalem is a praise on the earth yet? Anybody want to take that one and say, oh, sure, everybody loves Jerusalem? Or is it really a place of contention and conflict? See, the fullness of her righteousness has not yet shone out brightly, and so He will fight for this place until all is accomplished. That's Isaiah 42. He said, Adonai goes out as a mighty one. He stirs up His zeal like a man of war. He will shout, yes, raise a war cry. He will prevail over His enemies. He says, I have held my peace a long time. I have been still and restrained myself. And what the implication of that is, like, no, I haven't necessarily jumped at every little moment. But there is a time where His stillness and His restraint is going to come to an end. And He will fight for His people. When you look at those three statements in verse 1 and verse 7 about the until, He gives three conditions. Until her righteousness shines out, until salvation, essentially is there as a blazing torch, until He establishes and makes Jerusalem a praise. On that first point, one thing that Isaiah has proved throughout his book, his scroll, is that the people are not righteous. He's been saying that from the very first chapter, that they have rebelled against God, that their sins are as scarlet, and they need to be made white as snow. Righteousness is not something in their nature. It doesn't come naturally to them. It takes It must be something that's given to them, imparted to them from another source. It's just as even Abraham, as great of a man as he believed God. He believed in those promises that were given to him, that the covenant that God was talking about. He saw them fulfilled from a great distance. So he knew it was not something that was going to happen in his own lifetime, but he believed it anyway, and it was credited to him as righteousness. That's Genesis 15. It says Abraham, he was not the source of his own righteousness. Someone else was that, and that righteousness. That righteousness was given to him. And as we've been going through Isaiah has already identified him. Isaiah chapter 53 says, as a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied by his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, will make many righteous, and he will bear their iniquities. Jeremiah confirms his name, the name of Messiah, the branch. If Isaiah didn't make it clear enough, Jeremiah does. In chapter 23, he says, behold, the days are coming, it is a declaration of Adonai, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he will reign as king wisely and execute justice and righteousness where? In the land. In his days, Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell in safety. And this is his name by which he will be called, the Lord, or Adonai, our righteousness. That's what that looks like. Adonai Tzidkenu, yeah. Messiah has that name. He is the righteous one. Because he is the Memra, he is the word that we've been talking about in the Aramaic passages. He shares God's character, he shares God's holiness, his nature, his being. He is the image of the invisible God who imparts and bestows his righteousness to those who believe in him. He is the one, the righteous one. He is the Messiah, the one who makes the many righteous by bearing their unrighteousness. And by doing that, he is the one who shines out brightly. Isaiah described that all the way back in chapter 4. The process of making his people righteous, bestowing righteousness to them, taking care of that sin issue, that sin problem, is what makes it shine. Chapter 4, he says, after Adonai has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion, and has purged the blood of Jerusalem from her midst by the spirit of judgment and by the spirit of burning, then Adonai will create over the whole area of Mount Zion and over her convocations a cloud by day and smoke and shining of flaming fire by night. For over all glory will be a canopy. That righteousness, that glory is available to all who believe in Messiah. But when you read through, the letters even of Paul, he understood that he still battles the sin nature, that struggle. We are covered and clothed in a perfect righteousness, but none of us has fully arrived or attained that perfect righteousness here yet in our experience. We are a new creation. The old has gone and the new has come, but we still need to be fully, completely transformed. That happens, again, in the future. Until that day comes, we're still a part of the battle. That happens in the day when we are transformed in the last shofar. 1 Corinthians 15 puts it like this. He says, now I say this, brothers and sisters, that flesh and blood, corrupted flesh, still covered or still identified by our sin nature. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, and what decays cannot inherit what does not decay. Behold, I'll tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last shofar. For the shofar will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we will be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruptibility, and this mortal must put on immortality. And none of us have seen that yet. When Messiah is on the throne of David in Jerusalem, and all those who trust in him have been changed to incorruptible by his saving power, then Jerusalem's righteousness, the source of her righteousness, Messiah, will shine out brightly. Her righteousness shines out, and the salvation is as a blazing torch. And, it says, "For Zion's sake I will not keep silent, for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest until her righteousness shines out brightly and her salvation." Anybody know what that word is? The Yeshuatah? It's a form of his own name, Yeshua. Her salvation as a blazing torch. When Yeshua is as a blazing torch. And that's a very interesting word, that word torch. Isaiah uses it this one time in his whole book. But even this word is connected to our salvation. If you went to our covenants class that we did earlier this year, this is another connection to our covenant of salvation and redemption, the Abrahamic covenant of Yeshua's connection to all of that. Back in Genesis 15, not long after he had said, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. It says, when the sun set and became dark, behold, there was a smoking oven and a fiery torch. That's the same word that passed between these pieces that had been split. It says, on that day Adonai cut a covenant with Abram, saying, I give this land to your seed, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates River. The people and the land are connected. Messiah, our salvation, our righteousness, our Yeshua is the blazing torch that sealed the covenant that we all must start with in our walk with God. We've got to start with the covenant of redemption. We've got to start with that moment. The Abrahamic covenant, that's the model for our faith, the terms under which our own redemption and deliverance from Egypt occurs, under which we pass through the waters. And the one who officiated all of that, the priest Melchizedek, the king of righteousness, the king of Salem, the king of peace. And I could camp all day long on that connection and talk about that for a long time. Because God will not keep silent until every eye can see, until every knee bows and every tongue confesses that Yeshua the Messiah is the one that we've been waiting for and hoping for, is the Lord of all, to the glory of God the Father. And everybody sees it. And God's people, the Jewish people, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, they have a place in all of that. Verse 2 goes on, it says, nations will see your righteousness, and all kings your glory. Messiah is both Israel's righteousness and her glory, the Son of David seated on the throne, but he also in making the people righteous. The nations are supposed to see that as well. The first thing the nations have really seen of this glory of God's redemption, the first thing that they consider, the first thing that they have recognized, and the first thing they have appreciated has proven to be the righteous one, Messiah. It's Messiah and his identity and his name has gone out into the nations. The Goy have seen and embraced him first, even at much greater rates than they embraced the people through whom he came. They're willing to embrace him and not understand the place. It still amazes me to this day. You tell some people that, Jesus was Jewish, and some people are surprised. Y'all realize that, right? It's kind of a shocking thing, but yes, it still happens. But this is the brilliance of the enemy's strategy in all of this. First, he tries to minimize the Jewish people from embracing and recognizing their righteousness in Messiah. But then secondly, he wants to keep the Jew and Gentile from embracing and recognizing each other as brothers and sisters in seeking the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the Goy, the nations, the Gentiles, without that anchor, without the mooring of solid Torah theology and practice, those nations who embraced the Jewish Messiah began to drift into places, into error that the Torah, the Jewish people, would have stopped them from going had they remained together. But when those two tactics are reversed, when the Jewish people recognize him, when they say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, and the Jew and the Gentile come together. Paul puts it like this: if their rejection has led to the reconciliation of the world, then what will their acceptance be? But life from the dead. When things start turning, when the eyes of are being opened, then we haven't seen anything yet. Because in that day, resurrection will shine forth, and no one will be able to ignore it. You know, the King will be on the throne in power and in glory, and we will be called even by a new name, which is what he talked about, where he says, nations will see your righteousness, and all kings your glory, and you will be called by a new name, which Adonai's mouth will bestow. And so those who have joined themselves to the King, who have pledged their loyalty to him, who both Jew and Gentile, will receive this new name given to him by him, just like one was given to Abram, now Abraham, just like he did to Jacob, now Israel. Yeshua himself promised to give the new name. Revelation chapter 2, he says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit, what the Ruach is saying to Messiah's community. To the one who overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna. And I will give him a white stone, and written on the stone a new name that no one knows except the one who receives it. Or chapter 3 says, to the one who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he will never leave it. And on him I will write the name of my God and the name of the city of my God. And it's not New York, it's not Paris, London, Rome, Shanghai, or any place else. It's the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and my own new name. Lo and behold, there's something important about Jerusalem, isn't there? There's something about the temple which holds the King's throne. There's something about receiving the new name. Maybe it's me, but I'm starting to think and believe that there's at least some kind of connection between what's happening in Isaiah and what's happening in Revelation. Anybody else wondering about that? Is there a connection between what we call the Old Testament and the New? Who knew? As if they're building on the same prophecy, on the same truth, as if they are drawing from the same source. It's like they're both hearing from the same God, and they're looking forward to the same future. Again, in the land, in the city, with the King, Messiah, on the throne. And God will not be silent for Zion's sake. He will not rest for Jerusalem's sake. What's that word? Let me hear it. What's the word? He will not rest. He will not be silent until these things, all these things, come to pass. God is going to establish, he is going to make firm, he is going to make it unshakable, Jerusalem. He's going to make them a praise in the earth. The place and the people, her righteousness shining brightly, her salvation blazing forth and being a light. And Jerusalem is not going to be a place of contention, of conflict, but of peace and of worship. And again, that's not Washington, D.C. It's not Knoxville. It's not any place else. Those places are not our future. Jerusalem, the city of peace, is the throne of the King, and it was wrong to ever move the focus of God's people away from Jerusalem. And no matter what it looks like today, no matter what's happening today, no matter the threats, no matter the turmoil and the conflict that is going on, or all the threats, the future that Isaiah is talking about, the until, is still before us. And it's a comfort to know that he will not rest. He will not be silent. That Sabbath rest that is to come, that is promised in the book of Hebrews chapter 4, it will not come until this is all fulfilled. And God's people will experience that abundant life with their new name in his name. In verse 3 it says, you will also be a crown of beauty in the hand of Adonai. That's what he is promising, what he wants his people to experience. You will also be a crown of beauty in the hand of Adonai, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. This is the best that any of us could ever hope for. That he will delight in us, that he will see us as beautiful because of how he has redeemed us and how he has made us his bride. He says in verse 4, no longer will you be termed forsaken, no longer will you be termed desolate. Instead, you will be called, my delight is in her, and your land married. And who knows the name of the song that this verse is made of? Yeah, you know that song, Beulah Land? That's the word married, Beulah. That's where that song comes from, if you know it. My delight is in her, and your land married, for Adonai delights in you, and your land will be married. For as a young man marries a virgin, so your sons will marry you. As a bridegroom rejoices over a bride, so your God will rejoice over you. And then he will parade us through the streets in the city of joy, or in the city in joy and in gladness. In verse 10, he says, go through the gates. Clear the way for the people. Build up the highway. Remove the stones. Lift up a banner over the peoples. Make it, widen the roads. So increase the traffic, essentially. Verse 11, behold, Adonai has proclaimed to the ends of the earth. Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your salvation comes. See, his reward is with him, and his recompense before him. Then they will call them the holy people, the redeemed of Adonai. And you will be called a sought out and a city not forsaken. That is a great and glorious day. That is something that we should all be looking forward to. Because that future, it's not just an abstract idea, but it's a solid and firm foundation that gives us strength to carry on, to endure to that end, to help us to overcome, as Revelation talked about, calls us to, as we keep the commandments and hold to the testimony of Yeshua, hold to the testimony of salvation. And so even if we are in a time of great hardship or decline, we take hold, we trust in the fact that God will not rest, and he will not be silent until all the promises are fulfilled, until her righteousness shines out brightly and her salvation as a blazing torch.